It was raining the morning I lost everything. Portland's sky hung low and silver, the kind of quiet that makes the smallest sound feel like thunder. I opened my laptop out of habit, half awake, coffee cooling beside me. One new email from the bank. Subject: account access terminated. At first I thought it was a system glitch. I tried again. The page reloaded and flashed a message I had never seen before: user not authorized. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then called our accountant David. His voice came back hesitant. Evelyn. Greg signed the sale this morning. The transfer went through at 8:17. My hand froze around the mug. Sale? What sale? He hesitated again, then added quietly, Pierce Printing and Design. Sold to Denise Carver. Everything's finalized. I clicked the attachment he sent. The contract opened like a confession. Pierce Printing and Design Sale Agreement. Seller Gregory Pierce. Buyer Denise Carver. At the bottom, Greg's neat signature, Gregory Pierce, sole owner, sat alone on the page. Sole owner. I read the words until they lost shape. 5 years of my bookkeeping, design revisions, invoices, at midnight contracts, carefully drafted by hand, all erased by 2 signatures I never saw. The rain grew louder against the window. From the kitchen came the sound of a chair scraping the tile. Greg was sitting at the table in his robe, reading the business section like any ordinary Tuesday. He didn't even look up. You did this, I said, voice thin. You sold it without me. He flipped a page. It was never yours, Evelyn. The way he said my name like a password he no longer needed hit harder than the words themselves. Behind him, steam rose from the kettle I had filled earlier. He poured himself tea, then finally glanced at me. You'll understand when things settle. I wanted to ask what that meant, but Ruth's voice cut in from the living room. A woman shouldn't meddle in contracts, her husband signs, she said without turning from the television. Her tone had that casual cruelty of someone who had rehearsed it for years. The screen light flickered over her face as if she drew warmth from it. Greg smirked, folded the newspaper, and said, You'll learn the price of silence soon enough. Something inside me went still. I walked past both of them and into the small office off the hallway, the room that had been mine since the first day we opened the shop. The air smelled of paper and ink, familiar and grounding. I pulled open the filing cabinet and reached for the black external drive I kept in the back. Every invoice, every contract, every client communication copied, dated, backed up. I had done it out of habit, not distrust. Or maybe some part of me had always known. The drive felt heavy in my palm, colder than metal should be. I tucked it into my coat pocket, zipped the pocket shut, and looked around the room one last time. The framed photo on the desk showed Greg and me at the ribbon cutting 5 years earlier. He was smiling, arm around me. I looked younger, proud, unaware of how temporary trust could be. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet. I heard Greg's voice again in the kitchen, low, confident, talking on the phone, probably Denise. Something about phase 1 complete. My pulse steadied. The shock was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was calculation. I picked up my notebook and wrote 3 lines across a blank page, March 12th, 2024. He sold the company. He forgot who built it. The pen didn't tremble. My breath did. I closed the notebook, slid it into my bag, and walked back through the kitchen. Greg looked up, phone still in hand. Where are you going? To remember what's mine, I said. He frowned but didn't follow. Ruth muttered something about ungrateful wives. The door closed behind me with the softest click, but it sounded like a gavel. In the car, the windshield wipers struggled against the storm. For a second, I saw my reflection in the glass, tired, calm, unrecognizable. Everything was gone, at least on paper. But paper was my language. I whispered to the storm. He sold the company, but he forgot who built it and drove toward the downtown lights that waited like witnesses. When we opened the shop in 2011, the smell of fresh paper felt like possibility. We leased a narrow unit off Southeast Morrison in Portland. Concrete floors, one stubborn window, a secondhand digital press that rattled like a train. Greg hauled boxes and drove a dented van that leaked in the rain, while I took every call, wrote every estimate, and learned the language of margins and bleed. Our first week, I stayed until midnight to fix a bakery catalog. Greg fell asleep on packing blankets. I slid the finished invoice under their door and walked back to the car with stunned pride. By autumn, we had 2 steady clients and a spreadsheet that became my second memory. I knew who forgot to outline fonts and who paid on the 15th. Greg joked that I loved the ledger more than weekends, and I laughed because then it sounded like a compliment. Ruth visited on Fridays with cookies and sentences that rustled like dry leaves. Men build things, she said, women keep them tidy. I poured tea and went back to the estimates. Growth came in careful steps. We expanded into the next unit, upgraded the press, added a cutter that sang a bright metal song. Greg began to enjoy chamber breakfasts and the sound of owner attached to his name. I rarely corrected him because I wanted the business more than I wanted the credit. The accountant said keeping Greg as named proprietor was cleanest for taxes. I said fine, as long as the work stayed honest. Control arrived like drizzle. Greg asked to sign off on rush orders. He wanted the company card kept in his wallet. He said vendors trusted a man's handshake. I said they trusted invoices paid on time. He sent me receipts after spending not before deciding. When I told him the fuel bill spiked, he said I was reading columns wrong. When I said a client needed a contract renewal, he said I had become too cautious. When our first employee asked about benefits, Greg laughed and said we were a family, and family did not need paperwork. Ruth found small ways to make me smaller. Greg is the head, and you are the hands, she said as I reconciled the bank feed. I offered to show her the profit and loss. She waved me off and asked if dinner was ready. Numbers would not talk over me. They waited to be read. The first true crack came on a Monday when the password to our shared email failed. Greg shrugged and said the system was weird sometimes. By lunch, he was using a new address that forwarded only to his phone. He called it efficient. That evening, I asked for the reset code. He tossed his phone on the table and said he would handle it tomorrow. Tomorrow took its time and never arrived. The next week, he told staff that account issues would go through him first. Our designer looked at me then at the floor. I smiled at her because I refused to let humiliation be the last word in the room. I began copying key files to an external drive each Friday. I told myself it was good practice. I did not use the word insurance. Summer brought smoke and long afternoons. Greg basked in attention when new clients walked in. We argued in front of a vendor after he promised a discount I had not approved. After the vendor left, he slammed his phone down hard enough to make the staplers jump and told me to be grateful he kept work flowing. I reminded him gently that money without terms leaves faster than it comes. He called me cold and ungrateful. I went home and balanced the books by the glow of a cheap lamp while Ruth hummed in the kitchen. She asked if I planned to thank Greg for the opportunity he had given me. I said I planned to submit the quarterly taxes on time. She shook her head like I had missed the point of my own life. By the second winter, we were doing better than ever. Success did not soften Greg. It hardened his appetite for control. He asked me to run small purchases past him, even if they fell below the threshold we had agreed on. I said we needed a new service contract for the press. He said the old one would hold. It did not, and the breakdown cost more than the contract would have. The day after, he told me the bank had called about a limit and that he would take the conversation. I asked for details. He said there was no need for me to worry. I believed him because I wanted to believe in us. Then the staff email bounced for everyone. Greg said the provider had changed settings. That afternoon, he announced a new rule. All client communication would route through a central box he managed. Autonomy slid off the desk like a stack of proofs nudged by a careless elbow. I told him I needed access to send contracts. He said I was overreacting. He said I should be grateful to have fewer messages. He said I would thank him for protecting my time. That night, I counted the quiet ways a person can make another person small. The next day, I tested the old login. I sent a polite note from my personal address asking the provider for a reset. Greg confronted me in the hallway with a phone to his ear and said I was undermining him, that I did not respect the chain of command. I told him we were a family shop. He said families need a leader. Ruth nodded from the doorway like a chorus. Stop fussing with numbers, she said. Let a man handle the big things. I returned to my desk and opened a new notebook. On the first page, I wrote a title, Internal Ledger. Below it, I wrote a date and the story of a small charge that did not match a delivery. Then another line, and another. I logged every receipt, every adjustment, every time a password failed. I noted which vendors called me back and which ones now called Greg. I listed the day he moved the company card to his wallet and called it easier for gas and supplies. I listed the afternoon he promised a discount I had never approved and called it charm. I listed the night he told me to be grateful he let me be here. By spring of the third year, I had a habit I could not quit. Fridays, I closed the books, copied the files to the drive, and slipped it into my bag. I went home, cooked something simple, listened to Ruth, rate the neighbors, nodded and washed plates, and thought about margins both on paper and in marriage. I did not yet say the word control. I only knew that love had started to feel like a ledger. You enter what you give, you wait to see what clears, and you learn to live with a balance that never matches what you put in. February in Portland always carried a damp chill that crept into the bones of the building. The heaters hummed while the machines clicked through orders that never seemed to stop. On a Thursday morning, I was checking invoices when Travis, our new hire, leaned against the doorway with a grin that didn't know it was about to change everything. He said, Denise stopped by yesterday to ask about the acquisition paperwork. I asked what acquisition, and his smile faded. He stammered that she mentioned a possible buyout, something Greg was excited about. I felt the air thin. After he left, I opened the shared folders and searched every client directory. Nothing. Then I found a single email thread buried under archives labeled Potential Acquisition Discussion Confidential. My name was nowhere in the recipients. The sender was Denise Carver. The last message from Greg read, Thanks for keeping this between us until everything is official. I stared until the cursor blinked like a pulse. When Greg came in, I asked about it. He laughed softly like I had asked about the weather. Don't dig into things that don't concern you, Evelyn. You're making me look bad in front of real partners. I said quietly that I was a partner. He said not in this deal. That night, Ruth arrived for dinner with her usual perfume that filled the hall before her voice did. She sat down and said, No one buys a company for its wife. Greg smiled at that eyes meeting hers like they shared the same private joke. I cut the meat, counted to 5, and kept my voice even. If the company is being sold, then the wife should know. Greg shrugged and said nothing was final. After dinner, he took a call outside. Through the window, I saw him pacing, his reflection distorted in the glass. His tone was low, deliberate. Once the deal is through, she'll be out. I heard it clear as the rain on the gutters. Fear crawled up, but something colder followed. When he came back, I was already washing the plates. He kissed my shoulder and said Denise sends her regards. The next morning, he was gone early. I checked the petty cash box and found the new lock. My old key turned useless in my hand. The receipts from last week were missing. He had replaced the ledger with a new notebook that started clean. Clean meant empty of me. I sat down, opened my computer, and printed copies of every major contract, every client record, and every tax document. I placed them in a folder marked Personal Reference and hid it in my bag. The rest of the day I smiled when Ruth came by with sandwiches, asked if she could bring Denise to help decorate the office for spring. I said sure because saying no would have given away how much I knew. Travis looked nervous all day. At closing time, he whispered that Greg had mentioned bringing in outside investors. I asked him to forward anything strange he received. He nodded like a man who understood more than he wanted to. That evening, Greg came home cheerful, poured wine, and said the business world was changing and we needed flexibility. I asked if flexibility meant erasing my name. He said it meant growing up. The word lodged in my throat. After he fell asleep, I walked to the office in my robe and slippers. The night smelled of rain and printer ink. I unlocked the back door and turned on a single desk lamp. The files looked harmless, stacked in their drawers. I plugged in a small flash drive and started copying everything: client databases, tax filings, asset registers, scanned contracts. At 2 in the morning, I heard a car pass outside and froze, listening to its fade. When the last file finished, I ejected the drive and tucked it into my pocket. Then I reached into the desk drawer and pulled out the small camera I had bought months ago to film design tutorials. I mounted it behind the bookshelf aimed toward Greg's desk and checked the feed from my phone. The picture was clear. The red dot glowed like a heartbeat. I turned off the lamp and sat there for a while in the half-light, listening to the machine settling. The fear was still there, but now it served me. I thought of Ruth's words about wives and contracts and wondered if she would still say them if she saw the papers I just saved. At dawn, I returned home. Greg was still asleep. His phone buzzed once on the nightstand with a message preview: "Meeting confirmed 10 a.m. with D. Carver." I left it unread and went to shower. The mirror fogged while I whispered the plan to myself. Keep quiet, keep copies, keep time on your side. That afternoon, Travis texted me a screenshot of an internal memo. It said management transition meeting, scheduled March 10th. The subject line read, "Project Renewal." I thanked him and told him to clear his tracks. I spent the weekend rearranging client backups into chronological order, labeling each folder with the initials of whoever signed it. By Sunday night, I had a full record of our financial history. When Greg asked why I looked tired, I said tax prep. He smiled, relieved I still cared about numbers. I almost laughed. Monday morning, the light hit the office just right, glinting off the press like it had the day we opened. Greg was humming to himself, phone pressed to his ear. He said something about final signatures and coffee with Denise. I looked up and met his eyes as he turned. He winked like we still shared a secret. The printer whirred feeding blank pages into the tray. I thought of how easily a clean sheet can hide what used to be written. That night, I set up automatic backups from every system we used. Files uploaded line by line to my private cloud, each one a small act of insurance. At midnight, I checked the feed from the hidden camera. Greg had returned to the office after dinner lights on, talking to Denise. The audio caught enough to confirm what I already knew. He told her once the deal was done, I would have no legal standing. She laughed softly and said he was lucky to have a wife that quiet. I watched until he turned off the light. Then I closed the app and finally slept. Suspicion had finished its job. Fear had moved aside. Resolve had taken the chair. March 17th began with a thin drizzle that blurred the windows of the print shop and made the street shimmer like a film reel. Greg had spent the week boasting about a partnership celebration, claiming it would show clients how far we had come. He ordered banners with the new logo I had never approved, catering from a downtown bistro and a photographer to document his rise. My name was on none of the invitations. When I asked if I should prepare remarks, he smiled in that polished way that hides a dismissal. "You should relax tonight, Evelyn. Enjoy it like a guest." By 6, the office was a theater. Music, low lights, 2 bright people sipping from stemmed glasses, while Greg performed among them like a host on a talk show. Denise arrived in a red dress that matched the color of the company logo. She kissed his cheek and called him her visionary partner. The staff clapped politely. I felt the sound move through me like static. Ruth hovered near the buffet, whispering to 2 women from accounting that some people don't know when to step aside. I stood near the edge of the crowd, a glass of sparkling water warming in my hand. Greg tapped the microphone and said a few words about growth, about vision, about risk takers. He never once said we. When the applause faded, someone asked if I would speak. Greg laughed. "Evelyn needs a rest," he said. "Women take stress differently." The line drew a few uneasy smiles. He clinked his glass and moved on. My throat tightened, but my face held steady. I raised my glass and nodded toward him, as if we had planned it together. The photographer caught that moment, my faint smile framed by light. Later, I would see the picture online and think how much it looked like Grace. Travis found me near the copier, half hidden behind a column of boxes. His voice was low. "You should see this," he said, pressing a small silver USB into my hand. I looked down and recognized the model he used for design backups. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated. Something I found on the server before Greg locked me out. Then he walked away before I could ask more. I slipped it into my clutch and returned to the noise. Denise was on Greg's arm as they toasted to new beginnings. She said collaboration is about trust, and everyone laughed like it was charming. The irony was almost beautiful. Ruth came over with that measured pity she wore like perfume. "Don't take it personally, dear. Men carry the world's weight." I smiled and said, "Maybe that's why they keep dropping it." Her lips tightened. I excused myself and went upstairs to my old office, now labeled Operations. I closed the door, plugged in the USB, and waited. The file folder held one item: audio, 20 minutes long. The first voice was Greg, the second Denise. They were discussing the acquisition price. She said the offer was too low. He said we could adjust the books, move a few contracts, make it look less profitable. She asked how they would split the difference. He said $70,000 for the trouble. She laughed and said, "Make it neat." My hands went cold on the keyboard. I listened twice to be sure. Every word landed like a nail. Downstairs, I heard the muffled pulse of music and voices rising. I printed the transcript, every line clean and dated. Then I opened a folder labeled Financials, 2021-2024, and slipped the pages inside right after the latest balance sheet. On the front, I placed a sticky note, signatures that cost him. When I rejoined the party, Greg was shaking hands with a local investor. Denise leaned close, whispering in his ear. The photographer caught another picture this, one of them laughing while I stood behind them, glass raised just slightly higher. People began to leave around 9. Travis met my eyes across the room, small nod, silent understanding. Ruth kissed my cheek and said the night had gone perfectly. I said yes, almost perfect. Greg asked if I enjoyed myself. I told him I did that. It was nice to watch success up close. He grinned, pleased by what he thought was surrender. Outside neon from the liquor store sign across the street washed the sidewalk in red. Denise's car door clicked. Greg helped her in. Their laughter trailed behind like perfume. I stood by the window with the last of the guests, watching their reflections merge with the light. "They think silence is surrender," I whispered. "It's just the sound before proof." The phrase settled in my chest like steel. When I went upstairs to turn off the lights, I paused at the camera feed on my phone. The red indicator blinked softly, insurance still recording. The office smelled of champagne and toner. I stacked the leftover glasses, cleaned the tablecloth, and left one copy of the audio transcript sealed in an envelope in Greg's desk drawer, unmarked. Another I took home, locked in my personal safe behind the false panel. The house was quiet when I entered. Greg came home an hour later, humming off key smelling of cologne and applause. He asked if I was angry. I said no, just tired. He laughed, kissed my hair, and said he knew I'd come around. When he fell asleep, I opened my laptop and wrote the day's entry in my ledger. March 17th, partnership celebration. Public exclusion noted. Evidence secured. Tomorrow, review timeline for contracts and signatures. I saved it, closed the file, and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the clock mark every second of his borrowed pride. Outside, the rain began again, soft and certain. The morning after the party, the air in the house felt hollow. Greg left early with a hangover disguised as confidence. I watched his car disappear and realized I did not feel anger anymore. It was something colder, a grief that moved in straight lines. By noon, I called Amelia Grant, a lawyer I had known since college. We had lost touch when life became a list of ledgers, but her voice sounded the same, brisk and clear. I told her what happened, every detail I could verify. She listened without interrupting until the line went silent. "You can't undo the sale," she said finally, "but you can expose the fraud." Paper trails talk louder than outrage. She told me to document everything and to move quietly. I met her that afternoon at a small cafe near Hawthorne. She wore gray and carried a briefcase that looked older than most marriages. When I slid the printed transcripts across the table, she read them once then, again slower. "This is solid," she said. "If they altered the valuation for personal gain, that's misrepresentation." She paused, eyes narrowing. "But be careful, Evelyn. Public truth is a sharp thing. Use it right and it cuts clean. Use it wrong and it cuts you too." I nodded. The next day, I began to build a record that could speak for itself. While Greg paraded through meetings, I organized every receipt, every wire transfer, every unfiled tax note. In the quiet hours before dawn, I started something new, a space that belonged only to me. The blog began as a whisper. I called it Paper and Payback. The first post told the story of an unnamed woman who built a small business beside her husband, only to be erased when success came. I described the smell of ink, the endless nights, the feeling of watching your name vanish from contracts you wrote. I didn't use mine or Greg's, only the language of patterns. The words were clean, factual, restrained. By the end of the week, the post had 12,000 views. By the next, 100,000. Comments poured in from women who said they had lived the same story in different rooms. I answered none of them. I just wrote. Each entry unpacked another layer of what it means to be sidelined behind closed doors. The attention startled me, but also steadied me. The grief that had wrapped itself around my ribs loosened. Every paragraph felt like a small return of power. Amelia checked in often. She said the traction was useful, but warned me not to tie it directly to the case. Stay anonymous. Let the work do the talking. I took her advice. Meanwhile, Greg and Denise continued their version of expansion. Their purchases grew careless. I still had access to the bank alerts routed through an older address Greg had forgotten existed. Each notification read like a confession. Spa visits, designer luggage, weekend retreats at the coast. I printed every line of the statements and filed them under a new tab labeled Discretionary Misuse. The folder thickened quickly. One afternoon, Denise posted a photo on social media from a resort in Palm Springs. I matched the date to the company card statement. $1,700. Memo line read, Client Entertainment. I stapled the image beside the receipt and wrote in blue ink proof of indulgence. The absurdity almost made me laugh. It was so predictable, the arrogance of people who think paper doesn't remember. By the second week, Greg grew suspicious. He came home later each night, phone glued to his palm, eyes narrow when he looked at me. "Have you been writing online?" he asked over dinner. "Someone sent me a link to some blog." I kept my face still. "What blog?" He studied me, waiting for a flinch. "It's just some bitter woman complaining about her husband. Sounds familiar." I met his gaze. If it hits too close, maybe it's true. He pushed back his chair, muttered something about ungrateful wives, and left. The door slammed hard enough to shake the picture frames. I waited until his car pulled away before I exhaled. That night, I added another post, this one, about silence as strategy. The traffic doubled by morning. A local podcast reached out asking for an interview. I declined, but their message became another screenshot from my archive. 2 days later, a new email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. Subject line read, "Stop or lose everything." The body contained one sentence. "You don't know who you're provoking." I read it twice, then forwarded it to Amelia. She responded within minutes. "Do not delete. Keep every message. This is evidence now." I moved it into a secure folder and labeled it Threat 1. I did not feel fear, only confirmation. The people who hide truth always mistake exposure for revenge. By the end of March, the blog had become a mirror too bright for Greg to ignore. At breakfast, he mentioned that Denise's investors were nervous about rumors. He glared at me like the air itself had betrayed him. I asked what kind of rumors. He said the kind that ruin reputations. Then he left for the office without saying goodbye. I sat there with my coffee cooling again, remembering the first email from the bank. The first lock changed. The first time Ruth told me to stay quiet. Every act of control had written its own counterweight. Now the record was turning back toward balance. That evening, I drove to the waterfront and parked where the city lights bent across the river. The water looked dark and endless but steady. I opened my notebook and wrote a single line. You can't undo what's been sold, but you can reclaim what was stolen. The grief that had once felt like stone turned to direction. I went home and uploaded the next post. Its title was simple: Blueprint for Payback. The ballroom of the downtown Portland hotel smelled of coffee carpet glue and the faint metallic note of ambition. May sunlight pressed through the tall windows, turning every polished surface into a mirror. Greg stood near the podium in a navy suit he could barely afford, flanked by Denise in pearl earrings and confidence. Banners with the slogan, "New Direction," lined the walls. The shareholders filled the rows, murmuring about innovation expansion in the future. I walked in 10 minutes after the session began, carrying a slim black laptop and a file case that clicked softly when I set it down. The projector light caught the edge of my hair, and for the first time in months, Greg looked unsure. Denise recovered first. "Mrs. Pierce, what a surprise," she said with a smile too tight. Greg cleared his throat. "This is a closed session, Evelyn." I said quietly that I was still a registered stakeholder, a technicality he had forgotten to erase. The moderator gestured for me to take a seat, perhaps sensing a storm. Greg launched into his presentation slides of numbers that glowed meaningless on the screen. Revenue projections, market opportunities, his voice carrying the rhythm of practiced deceit. When he finished, I stood and opened my laptop. I said I had a few supplemental materials that might clarify the record. The room went still. The first image appeared on the screen behind me, a scanned invoice from the company card. Palm Springs Resort, April 12th. Client entertainment, $1,700. The next slide showed 2 boarding passes, both names visible: Greg Pierce and Denise Carver. The third displayed an email chain authorizing the payment subject line, adjusting records pre-acquisition. A ripple moved through the audience. Greg's smile froze. He said I was misunderstanding business expenses. I clicked again. The audio began to play. Greg's voice came through the speakers, calm and unmistakable. "Once the deal is through, she'll be out." Denise's reply followed low and amused. "Make sure she stays quiet." The reaction was immediate. Denise went pale, then red. Greg stepped forward, shouting, "You're lying, that's not real, that's doctored." I turned toward him, steady. "It's your voice, Greg. Maybe lie to yourself instead." The moderator tried to regain order, but the crowd was already shifting. A man from the back, one of our longest clients, stood and said he wanted his contracts reviewed immediately. Another followed, murmuring something about ethics. I let the silence expand, then said, "Every number on these slides is verifiable. The records are stored off-site and have been shared with counsel." Denise whispered to Greg, but he pulled away, sweating under the lights. Someone snapped a photo. The flash made him flinch. I continued reading from a document Amelia had helped prepare. Under Oregon law, intentional misrepresentation during a corporate sale constitutes fraud. This evidence will be submitted accordingly. The sentence fell like a gavel. Denise tried to gather her papers, but they scattered. Greg looked at me as if seeing a stranger. I closed the laptop and said quietly to the room, "The truth doesn't need volume, it just needs receipts." One by one, the major clients rose and left. The largest investor paused at the door, met my eyes, and nodded once before walking out. Greg called after him, voice breaking, trying to explain. The photographers who had come for press coverage turned their lenses toward him instead. Security entered at the request of the event manager when the shouting grew. They asked him to step outside. As they led him through the corridor, a reporter snapped another picture flash, catching the tear in his suit pocket. Denise trailed behind, face hidden behind a folder. The doors closed and the sound of the latch echoed louder than applause. I gathered my files slowly, the calm that comes when fear finally leaves the body. The moderator approached, stammering apologies for not knowing what was happening. I told him it was no one's fault, but theirs. Outside, the afternoon light had turned harsh, the kind that shows every imperfection. Greg stood near the curb, arguing with someone on the phone, his voice hoarse. The same photographer raised his camera again, the lens glinting like a mirror. I passed by them and said to no one in particular, "That's what honesty sounds like." Back inside, the air shifted. The women who had watched quietly from the side began whispering. One of them, a middle-aged accountant, touched my arm. "Thank you for doing what we all imagined," she said. I smiled, not triumphant, but steady. Justice, when it arrives, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stands there undeniable. By evening, the story had already reached the local business forums. Someone posted a photo captioned, "Woman exposes fraudulent sale at shareholder meeting." I didn't read the comments. I poured tea, sent a brief email to Amelia with the attached audio file, and labeled the folder Final Exposure. Greg didn't come home that night. I saw his car in the news later, parked crooked outside the hotel lights still on. The reporter's voice described the disruption as unexpected drama during a corporate event. They didn't know the half of it. Before bed, I wrote in my ledger again. May 3rd. Public exposure complete. Reaction immediate. Damage irreversible. Under notes, I added one final line. Silence broken by evidence feels like thunder. Then I closed the book and slept without dreams. The morning after the meeting, my phone did not stop ringing. Reporters, lawyers, former employees, even suppliers wanting confirmation. By noon, the Oregonian published the headline, "Pierce Printing Under Investigation." The article quoted an unnamed source describing altered valuations and fraudulent filings. My name was mentioned only once. Wife of former owner declined to comment. I read it twice and felt no need to correct them. Outside, the neighborhood had already shifted its loyalty. Ruth called 3 times before noon, but I let it ring. By afternoon, she appeared at my door wearing a beige coat and trembling hands. She looked smaller than I remembered. "He is drinking again," she said before I could speak. "Please, Evelyn, don't press charges. He is broken." Her voice cracked around the word broken. I poured tea, set her cup in front of her, and said quietly, "Forgiveness doesn't erase numbers." She flinched as if I had struck her. I told her he still had a chance to cooperate to return the documents voluntarily. She wiped her eyes and whispered, "He always said you'd never have the stomach for this." I looked at her and said maybe that was his first mistake. She left without finishing her tea. 2 days later, Amelia arrived at my house with a stack of folders and her efficient calm. She said the state inquiry had moved fast because of the publicity. They wanted a clean handover of the brand license to prevent further losses. Greg had lost his signing authority after the board suspended him. Denise had disappeared from Portland entirely, her condo emptied overnight. Amelia placed a form in front of me. "This requests return of your original intellectual property rights," she said. "It will reinstate you as the legal owner of the brand name Pierce Design." My hand didn't shake as I signed. "Justice doesn't shout," she said quietly beside me. "It signs in silence." The words landed like a closing circle. For a while, the house felt too quiet. I found myself listening to small sounds, the kettle, the rain tapping the skylight, the rustle of envelopes that used to hold invoices. Travis stopped by one evening to bring back some archived drives. He looked uneasy, but proud. "The team still talks about you," he said. "Some of them want to come back if you reopen." I thanked him and promised to let him know. Later, I stood by the window, watching his car leave, realizing how peace can sound foreign after chaos. Meanwhile, Greg's downfall unfolded in slow motion. His accounts were frozen, his phone disconnected. Photos surfaced of him leaving a downtown bar at noon, clothes wrinkled, eyes hollow. The same people who once praised his confidence now avoided his name. Ruth called again a week later. She said he was living with her now, sick, angry, refusing help. She asked if there was any chance to settle privately. I said the papers were already filed and the process would run its course. She muttered that the neighborhood was talking, that people were cruel. I reminded her that cruelty wasn't born yesterday. It had been growing quietly in her kitchen for years. She hung up. That evening, I sat in my study reviewing the official notice Amelia had sent over. The state had approved the claim to restore ownership of the Pierce Design trademark. My name, Evelyn Pierce, was printed alone on the certificate. I traced the letters slowly, the same way I used to check proofs before printing. There was a certain beauty in correction. Later that night, I opened my ledger again and wrote a short entry. June 8th, public silence, private balance. Under notes, I wrote the line Amelia had said. Justice doesn't shout. It signs in silence. The days that followed carried a strange calm. Some neighbors nodded when they saw me, others avoided eye contact. At church, the pastor spoke about truth as discipline rather than vengeance. Ruth stopped attending services after they removed her from the treasurer's post. The congregation said it was for transparency, but everyone knew why. I didn't gloat. I simply noticed how systems correct themselves when truth enters the room. Amelia called one afternoon to say Greg had finally received the formal demand. He would have to relinquish any remaining rights and repay a portion of the diverted funds. He refused at first, then tried to negotiate. She said calmly that evidence leaves no room for negotiation. When I hung up, I walked outside into the garden. The hydrangeas were starting to bloom again, pale blue under the gray sky. I remembered planting them the first year of the company when Greg still believed in partnership. For a moment, I felt the old ache of what could have been, but it passed quickly. That night, I drafted a letter to the employees who had stayed silent through the ordeal. I told them the company might reopen under a new name and that integrity would be its foundation. No slogans, no false promises, just work done right. Before bed, I reread the article from the Oregonian one last time. The photo showed the old building with the shutters down. The caption read, "Investigation continues." I smiled faintly, folded the paper, and placed it inside my ledger. History deserved its own page. The next morning, the light through the kitchen window was sharp and white, reflecting off the signature line of the returned trademark document. I placed my pen beside it, thinking of Amelia's words again. Justice doesn't shout. It signs in silence. July arrived with air so dry it seemed to erase sound. The garden had gone pale under the heat, leaves crisp flowers bowed. I had learned to enjoy silence again, mornings with coffee and the steady rhythm of rebuilding. Then one afternoon, a knock shattered it. When I opened the door, Greg stood there, thinner hair streaked gray that hadn't been there 2 months ago. His shirt clung to him, collar wilted. In his hand was a large envelope already softened at the edges. "Denise left," he said before I could speak. They shut down the office. I have nothing left. His voice was brittle, and for a moment I almost saw the man I had once built a life with. Almost. He stepped inside without waiting, glancing around as if expecting to find the furniture rearranged by guilt. The house smelled of lemon polish and distance. He placed the envelope on the table and said he had come to make peace. I asked if that was before or after the lawsuits. He looked down. "I made mistakes, Evelyn. I thought I could handle everything, but she used me. She drained me dry. I sold everything for her. Help me start again." The words sounded rehearsed, like a man auditioning for forgiveness. I poured him water, watched his hands tremble as he drank. "You didn't just sell the company," I said. "You sold your word." He flinched as if the sentence had weight. He muttered that everyone deserves a second chance. I said maybe, but not everyone earns one. He opened the envelope and slid a few papers toward me, mostly unpaid bills and final notices. I could see the bank logo stamped red. He said I could make it right, that investors would still listen to me, that we could rebuild together. I told him the past tense suited him better. His face hardened. "You always wanted control," he said. "You got it. Does it make you happy?" I told him happiness wasn't the goal, peace was. He laughed once, dry and sharp. "You think this is justice. You destroyed me." I reminded him that I only revealed what was already true. He stood up too quickly, knocking the chair. The envelope spilled across the floor, letters fluttering like weak excuses. He bent to gather them, but stopped halfway, his breathing rough. I noticed how unsteady he had become. When he left, he didn't look back. That evening, Ruth called. Her voice was raw. "He is sick, Evelyn. The doctor said liver failure. Please, he needs help," I said quietly. "Karma always knows the address." She gasped, maybe expecting mercy. I hung up before she could say more. The next week, Amelia called to update me. The Financial Review uncovered another account Greg had opened under the business name used to withdraw $60,000 before the sale. She asked if I wanted to pursue recovery. I said yes. She filed the suit within days. Greg ignored the first notice, then appeared in court looking like a shadow. The judge asked if he had representation. He said no. The evidence spoke for itself. Transfers documented timestamps aligned with Denise's travel expenses. Amelia presented it calmly, a clean chain of cause and consequence. Greg tried to speak, saying it was complicated, that he had intended to repay it. The judge asked if any repayment existed. None. The ruling came swift. Restitution of the full amount, plus interest forfeiture of his personal residence to satisfy the debt. Greg stared at the floor while the clerk read the decision. When it ended, he didn't look at me. Outside the courthouse, Ruth waited near the steps. She looked older, her face drawn by nights of regret. She asked if there was no other way. I said there had been many chances, all spent. She whispered that he was staying with her now in a rented house near Gresham, barely able to walk some days. I told her I hoped he found peace with what was left. Then I walked away, not out of cruelty, but completion. 2 weeks later, Amelia called again. The transfer had cleared $60,000 returned to my account. She congratulated me, but I only said thank you. Money could fix paperwork, not memory. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote another entry in the ledger. July 24th. Case closed. Balance restored. Under notes, I wrote 3 words. Debt equals lesson. The house felt lighter after that. I opened the windows to let the evening air move through, carrying away the stale remnants of old guilt. Across the street, the neighbors' lights came on warm and steady. I thought of Ruth and Greg in their small rented house, 2 people surrounded by what they had built from pride and lost to consequence. I didn't wish them suffering, only understanding. In August, the court finalized the title transfer of Greg's former residence. The new owner was a young family starting a design business. I found it fitting. Cycles restore what greed distorts. I drove past once and saw them painting the porch blue, the same shade I used to favor for company brochures. Life has a sense of humor that way. Back home, I made tea and watched the sunset fade into the window pane, the color soft and forgiving. There was a time when I believed strength meant endurance. Now I understood it meant discernment, knowing when to stop carrying what was never mine to fix. Before bed, I reread Amelia's final email. The line at the end stayed with me. Closure isn't revenge, it's maintenance. I smiled, closed the laptop, and turned off the light. Outside, the crickets were loud. Again, the garden breathing under the night. Somewhere miles away, Greg and Ruth were counting bills and mistakes. Here, I counted peace. August arrived with soft mornings and the sound of renewal in the air. The worst of the heat had passed, and the city carried that faint smell of wet pavement after a night's rain. I was sitting on the porch when Amelia called. Her tone was lighter than usual. "It's official," she said. "Greg signed the transfer this morning. Pierce Design is now legally yours again. The papers will arrive by courier within the day." I thanked her but didn't smile until the document was in my hands. When the envelope came, I unfolded the first page slowly. My name sat clean at the bottom, next to a digital timestamp. His signature was above mine, faint but legible. A surrender sealed in ink. For a moment, I let the silence hold it. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like gravity returning to normal. That afternoon, I drove to the old office building, now empty and quiet. The lock clicked the same way it had when I first turned it 12 years ago. Dust floated in the light through the blinds. On the wall hung the faded Pierce Design logo, the letters uneven from heat. I stood there a long time before taking it down. That night, I opened my ledger again and wrote a single phrase across the top of a new page. Pierce and Grace Studio. The next morning, I filed the new registration under that name. Grace not for forgiveness, but for the quiet strength of starting again. Within a week, I had reopened the business as a smaller independent studio specializing in sustainable print and brand work. Two former employees reached out after reading the news. Travis returned first, bringing with him a calm efficiency that reminded me why I had hired him years ago. The second was Maria the accountant, who had once defended Greg's early ambitions. She said she wanted to work where truth wasn't an inconvenience. I told her there was a desk waiting. By the end of August, the office had color again. Boxes, unpacked plants on the windowsill printers, humming like old friends. I bought a new sign, white background, clean serif font. Pierce and Grace Studio. Underneath smaller letters read, "Built on Integrity." On the day we hung it, the sun broke through the clouds and hit the glass so bright it looked almost holy. That same morning, Amelia forwarded me a short notice from the court's financial division. Greg had received the final debt collection statement. His car was repossessed for unpaid taxes. The report noted that the tow happened the same hour his signature was logged on the trademark transfer. The symmetry was almost poetic. Denise resurfaced a week later in my inbox. Her email subject line read, "Application." She wrote that she admired how I had rebuilt and was seeking employment after her recent misfortunes. She said she wanted to contribute her marketing expertise to a woman-led company. I read the message twice, then drafted a brief reply. "Thank you for your interest, Denise. At this time, we are seeking candidates with a proven record of integrity." I hit send and archived the thread. The quiet that followed was exquisite. In the weeks that followed, orders trickled in from small businesses and nonprofits that had read about the case in the Oregonian. They said they wanted to work with someone who valued truth over image. I kept the operations modest, focused on precision rather than expansion. There was peace in small scale. Some evenings I stayed late just to hear the soft rhythm of machines printing again. The scent of ink and paper felt like home, but this time without fear. One afternoon, Travis handed me a framed quote he had printed. Justice signed in silence. He placed it on the wall behind my desk. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. That night, I walked through the building after everyone had gone. The lights from the street cast gentle stripes across the floor. I thought of all the signatures that had passed through these rooms, all the promises kept and broken. Now there was only one that mattered. Mine. The next day, Maria told me the first quarter projections showed profit already. It wasn't much, but it was clean. We celebrated with coffee instead of champagne. I preferred the honesty of it. Later that week, a courier delivered a thick envelope from Amelia. Inside was the official certificate of brand reinstatement. At the bottom, beneath the embossed seal, was the final confirmation date, August 18, 2024. I framed it and placed it beside the first contract ever signed under Pierce Design back in 2011. The contrast between beginnings and recoveries made me smile. News of the studio's reopening spread quietly through word of mouth and the network of small business owners who valued fairness over speed. Each client that came through the door brought stories of their own struggles. They said the name gave them hope. Grace, they said, was what they wanted to build on, too. One Friday evening, I stood outside locking up when the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of church bells from downtown. Across the street, a woman held her daughter's hand and pointed at the new sign. The little girl read it aloud, Pierce and Grace. I felt something settle inside me, not pride, but completion. When I got home, I found an envelope in the mail from the business registry. It contained the final confirmation letter and a copy of Greg's signature on the release form. His handwriting looked older, shakier. I held it under the lamp for a long moment. There was no anger left, only distance. Some lessons carved deep enough that you stop needing the echo. Before bed, I wrote my last line for the day. August 28th, reclaimed in full. The ink dried slowly, the paper absorbing every trace of the past. The headline appeared on a bright September morning, printed in bold across the business section. Woman reclaims stolen business and builds it better. The Oregonian ran a full-page feature with my photograph taken at the reopening sunlight behind me and the new sign shining in focus. The article traced the entire story from the fraudulent sale to the court decision and the rebirth of Pierce and Grace Studio. It mentioned the blog, Paper and Payback, as the catalyst for accountability and quoted Amelia, calling it a model of resilience through documentation. By noon, my inbox was filled with messages from women across the country. Small business owners, retirees, even college students. They said they had saved the article to show their daughters. One wrote simply, "You reminded me to keep my receipts." I printed that email and pinned it beside my desk. That evening, Ruth saw the story at the nursing home where she now lived. A nurse later told me she had read it aloud to the other residents, voice breaking halfway through. She said I raised the wrong son, then folded the paper and asked for silence. Greg had visited her only once that month. He had filed for bankruptcy after the repossession of his car and the final debt recovery. The report of his assets listed almost nothing left. It was strange how small the consequences looked on paper compared to the size of his arrogance. Meanwhile, Pierce and Grace continued to grow. We received invitations to speak at conferences about ethical rebuilding. Amelia convinced me to accept one, a statewide event titled Women in Small Business, hosted at the Portland Convention Center. The auditorium was packed with faces that looked both curious and kind. When I stepped onto the stage, I remembered every room where I had once been talked over, every meeting where silence was mistaken for weakness. I began with a simple sentence: "Justice doesn't need volume, it needs receipts." The crowd laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes from recognition. I told them that strength was not about shouting louder, but about writing everything down, keeping records holding truth in plain sight. I ended with one line that felt truer with age. Integrity may look quiet, but it echoes longer than noise. After the event, several women came to shake my hand, some with tears, others with notebooks ready. I felt their gratitude like a shared pulse. Later that week, the local TV station aired a short segment about the conference. The same clip played on Ruth's small television in her common room. The nurse said she watched it twice, then placed her hands together and whispered something no one caught. Greg did not appear in any of it. He was last seen leaving a courthouse in Gresham papers, in hand, avoiding cameras. The same photographer who once captured his triumph now captured his descent, the caption reading, "Former businessman files for bankruptcy following fraud case." When the segment ended, I turned off the TV and sat in the quiet. There was no triumph left, only completion. Still, karma's timing was precise. The week after the broadcast, a friend from City Records sent me a notice showing Greg's foreclosure finalized. The house he once guarded like a fortress now belonged to another family. I looked at the photo, attached the porch, stripped the garden empty. Life always repurposes arrogance into lesson. One Sunday, I drove to the cemetery on the edge of town, where his father, Richard Pierce, was buried. The man had been difficult but fair a builder of his own small printing business before time and illness took it from him. The marble was chipped around the edges, the inscription faint. I placed a single white rose on the stone and said quietly, "I fixed what he broke." The wind moved through the trees like a slow breath. I didn't stay long. On the way back, I stopped by the studio. The late sun poured through the windows, painting the floor gold. Travis was finishing an order and Maria was closing the books for the week. They both looked up and smiled. The office smelled of paper and clean ink, familiar but new. I thought about how every ruin carries the seed of its rebuild. We had proof. The next day, the Oregonian followed up with another piece, shorter but more reflective. It called Pierce and Grace a case study in ethical resilience. The editor wrote that sometimes justice doesn't come from courts, but from consistency. I clipped that one too and filed it in my ledger. The entries now formed a complete arc, from loss to recovery, each date, precise each outcome earned. The following weekend, I attended a community event for small business mentorship. I sat at a round table listening to younger women describe the obstacles they faced. One of them asked if I ever regretted not forgiving Greg sooner. I told her, forgiveness is not the same as permission. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone lost is let the consequences find them. She nodded slowly, understanding. On my way home, I passed the old hotel where the shareholder meeting had erupted months earlier. The banners were gone, replaced by advertisements for a wellness seminar. The irony wasn't lost on me. At a red light, I looked across to the same sidewalk where Greg had once shouted at reporters. The streetlight flickered, catching on the glass of the cafe window. Time had cleaned the scene better than any apology could. Back home, I made tea and opened the ledger again. The final page before the epilogue waited blank. I wrote the headline from the newspaper across the top. Woman reclaims stolen business and builds it better. Under it, I wrote the simplest summary possible. Truth endures. That night, I slept without dreams, the kind of rest that only comes when every account, financial and emotional, has balanced itself at last. The morning at Cannon Beach was silver, and still the kind of calm that erases sound. Mist hung low above the tide, and the sand glistened like glass. I stood near the shoreline with a cup of coffee, warming my hands, watching the horizon breathe. It had been 6 months since the company was sold out from under me, and yet here everything felt finally right. The wind carried salt and distance, and for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about deadlines or signatures. I was thinking about peace. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. The notification came from the dashboard of Paper and Payback. The blog had just crossed 1.5 million views. I sat on a driftwood log and opened the latest comment. It read, "We finally got our justice through your story." The name under it belonged to a woman from Minnesota who wrote about losing her pension to a corrupt business partner. She said reading about my fight gave her courage to report it. I read it twice, then closed my eyes. The ocean answered with its slow applause. Paper and Payback had started as a quiet form of survival, a place to put the truth when no one else would listen. Now it had become something larger, a collective record of voices like mine. Every post I wrote carried receipts not only for money but for dignity restored. My inbox overflowed daily with stories of betrayal turned into accountability, women who refused to vanish just because someone tried to silence them. That was the best kind of revenge, not noise, but permanence. I sipped my coffee and watched a dog chase the tide its owner, laughing behind. Life had returned to the small, necessary joys. A gull landed near me, bold and unbothered, tilting its head as if inspecting me for proof that I had learned something. I had. I learned that peace is not given. It is signed one choice at a time. The phone buzzed again. A message from Amelia. The Oregon Women's Council would like to invite you as keynote speaker for their annual summit in November. Her text ended with a small heart. I smiled. I hadn't planned on saying yes to anything public after the last conference, but this felt different. It wasn't about telling the story again. It was about showing what came after. I typed back, "Tell them I'll be there." The waves reached a little closer, washing over my shoes. I didn't move. I thought of Greg somewhere back in Portland, a man once so loud he drowned out reason, now learning what silence costs. I thought of Ruth, who had started sending me short letters from the nursing home. They were polite, regretful, written in careful cursive. I hadn't replied yet. Maybe someday, maybe never. Peace doesn't need an audience. I stood brushed sand from my coat and began walking toward the waterline. The tide mirrored the sky, pale and endless. I could see the reflections of clouds moving across its surface like memory itself. Somewhere behind me, the cafe that overlooked the beach was opening. I could smell fresh bread and espresso. Normal life had resumed, and I was part of it again. When I got back to the table outside the cafe, my laptop screen lit up with morning brightness. I opened the draft of my next post, titled "Payback Signed in Peace." The first sentence came easily. He sold the company. I signed my freedom. I paused and looked up at the ocean again before finishing the line. The sound of waves was steady, the kind of rhythm that asks nothing. I wrote for another hour, capturing not revenge, but restoration. Not anger, but the quiet luxury of integrity. When I finished, I uploaded a photo from the beach, just the sand and the sky meeting without edges. The cursor blinked beside the closing line I had already written days ago. Would you have signed your payback too? Justice can be quiet, but it always leaves a mark. I hit publish. The post went live with a soft click, no applause, no drama, just the steady hum of truth finding its place. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair. Around me, the cafe filled with the easy noise of morning cups, clinking laughter rolling in waves. The world kept moving, unaware that one story had just closed its final ledger. I finished my coffee watching the tide pull back, erasing footprints, but not direction. Before leaving, I glanced once more at the sea, the horizon shining like a clean page waiting to be written on. I whispered to no one. It signed. Then I turned and walked toward the street, the breeze behind me carrying the faint scent of salt and closure.